Have you ever walked into a room and felt a heaviness that wasn't yours? Have you ever found yourself weeping for reasons you can't explain or exhausted after simply being around other people? If so, you might be an empath. But what if I told you that being an empath is not just a gift? It's a dangerous power, one that can consume you if you're not careful. Today, we're going to explore Carl Jung's warning about empaths and why the truth is much darker and more transformative than you might think. In our culture, empathy is celebrated. We see it as a virtue, a sign of kindness, even a spiritual badge of honor. Social media is full of quotes about feeling what others feel, about being sensitive, about being a healer. But what if this popular image is only half the story? What if beneath the surface, empathy is not just about kindness, but about being a conduit for the unconscious forces of the world? Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, saw empathy as something far more complex and far more dangerous than most people realize. He believed that the unconscious is not just a personal thing. It's a vast collective force, full of ancient patterns and archetypes. When you're an empath, you're not just picking up on someone's mood. You're opening yourself to the deep, swirling currents of the collective unconscious. And that, Jung warned, is not always a blessing. So, what really happens when you open yourself to the pain of others? And what price do you pay for carrying what was never yours to begin with? Let's go deeper. Imagine a village healer in ancient times, kneeling in a field during a storm, vomiting blood. Not because they're sick, but because the land itself is ill. This is the true empath, a lightning rod for the world's suffering, a vessel for pain that is not their own. Most empaths don't realize this. They think they're just sensitive, but in reality, they are unconsciously vulnerable to the shadows and wounds of others. They become psychic sponges, absorbing not just emotions, but the unhealed traumas, the unloved parts, the archetypal shadows that others carry. I want you to picture this: a woman standing on a bridge above a chasm. She has no eyes. Her hands are outstretched, trembling, as if she's both reaching for help and warding something off. Below her, in the darkness, are voices, many voices crying out in despair, in longing, in confusion. She cannot see them, but she feels them. Her body bears the pain of each cry like a wound. That woman is the empath. Her blindness is not literal. It's a blindness to the origin of her suffering. She does not know where the voices end and where she begins. But what happens when you carry pain that isn't yours? What happens when you become a vessel for the world's suffering without even knowing it? Jung warned that the unconscious has no moral compass. It's a cauldron, sacred, but also chaotic. When an empath opens themselves to another's pain, they invite in not just feelings, but the unprocessed matter of that person's shadow. Most people walk the earth with shadows trailing behind them, unloved, untouched, feared, and the empath, if unguarded, becomes a refuge for those shadows. There's a story from African tribal law. A young dreamer hears the cries of nameless spirits at the edge of the forest. The tribe fears possession, but the elder teaches the dreamer to name the spirits, to speak with them. This is the lesson for empaths. If you don't name what you carry, you become a playground for disowned archetypes. Let's pause here. Have you ever found yourself feeling waves of grief, terror, or longing that seem to come out of nowhere? Have you ever wept at odd times, trembled in stillness, or laughed when no one had spoken? These are signs that you may be carrying more than your own emotions. So, how do you know if you're carrying someone else's pain? And what can you do to protect yourself from being devoured by it? Empathy, when unconscious, can become a subtle form of possession. Sometimes it comes as overwhelming compassion that drowns you. Sometimes it's a compulsive need to help, even at the cost of your own boundaries. Sometimes it's falling in love with people who are destroying you, not out of weakness, but because you've been seduced by their wounds. Jung called this enantiodromia, the reversal into the opposite. The healer becomes the harmed. The bearer of light becomes the host of another shadow. The longer this goes on, the more the empath loses the thread of who they truly are. Let me share a story from my own practice. I once treated a woman who cried incessantly every time she entered my office. Tears flowed before words. At first, she believed herself to be wounded by her parents, her lovers, her world. And indeed, there were wounds. But what revealed itself over months of careful descent was this. She had taken on the ungrieved sorrow of her mother, her grandmother, and her lineage of women before her, all of whom were forbidden to cry. She had become the vessel for a generational shadow. In carrying their sorrow, she had lost the language for her own. If you've ever felt lost in other people's pain, if you've ever wondered where you end and they begin, you're not alone. But there's a way out. The gift of feeling is sacred, but sacredness demands structure. The vessel must be strong enough to contain the fire, or the fire will consume. Jung taught that the path to wholeness, the path of individuation, requires boundaries. Not rigid walls, but a discerning membrane that lets in what is true and keeps out what is not. To be a conscious empath is to say, I feel you, but I do not become you. I see your wound, but I do not house it within my psyche. I offer presence, not possession. Let's take a moment to reflect. Where in your life have you confused compassion with codependence? Where have you made yourself essential to others as a way to avoid being alone with yourself? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary. But how do you build these boundaries? And what happens if you don't? Many empaths are born from trauma. A child who learns to read their parents' moods to stay safe. A boy who becomes hyper-attuned to his mother's depression. These children become empaths, not from spiritual grace, but from necessity. Their sensitivity is a survival strategy, later mistaken for a gift. But a gift that grows from fear must be purified. You must ask, who was I before the world told me to feel for others first? What part of me believes that love must hurt? What would happen if I stopped absorbing the pain around me? Let's pause. Imagine yourself as a child. Where did you learn about love? About safety? About your own needs? Did you learn that you had to take care of others to be loved? Did you learn that your feelings were less important than the feelings of those around you? These are not easy questions, but they're the doorway to freedom. When empathy becomes conscious, it transforms from absorption to alchemy. The empath becomes not a sponge, but a vessel. Not a martyr, but a mystic. Not a savior, but a mirror. This is the art of standing in the fire of another's suffering and remaining unburned, not through detachment, but through deep-rootedness in the self. The self is not just your feelings or your light, but your shadow, your instincts, your history, your future. When the empath finds this center, they become anchored. From that anchor, true compassion flows, not as sacrifice, but as strength. Let me share another dream. A man stands in a cathedral made of mirrors. He walks, and each step echoes with unfamiliar voices. He turns to look into a mirror, expecting his reflection, but instead sees a weeping child. Another mirror, a screaming soldier. Another, a dying mother. All these faces stare at him, and he does not know who they are. He begins to scream, "Which one is me?" But the mirrors do not answer. They only reflect. This, too, is the empath, lost in the mirrors of other people's inner worlds, unable to remember the face they wore before they began to feel everyone else's pain. But beware, even as you become empowered, another danger arises. The temptation to use your insight as a weapon, to manipulate rather than heal. As the empath becomes more conscious, the archetype of the magician stirs. The one who can see through illusion, who can speak to another's shadow without flinching. But if not anchored in humility, the magician becomes seduced by their own power. Empathy becomes manipulation, and the cycle repeats. To be a conscious empath is to wake up every day and ask, is this mine? Am I feeling or fusing? Am I healing or controlling? Am I present or performing? Let's reflect. Have you ever felt a dark pleasure in being the only one who understands someone else's pain? Have you ever used your empathy to feel important, needed, even holy? Sometimes, the act of helping others is a way of avoiding the self. Sometimes, The burden of carrying everyone else's suffering is more comforting than the silence of facing your own. These questions are not signs of doubt. They are signs of maturity. The unconscious empath is drawn to the wounded, the chaotic, the narcissistic. Not because they are naive, but because part of them believes they must prove their worth through suffering. They are pulled to those who mirror their unhealed inner child. But the conscious empath begins to crave clarity. They seek out those who see them, not just need them. They build bonds rooted not in trauma, but in truth. And if loneliness comes, they no longer fill it with the ghosts of broken souls. They sit with it. They listen. They let the silence speak. This is the true gift of the awakened empath. Not to be a receptor of pain, but a revealer of soul. If you see yourself in these words, if you recognize the symbols of overgiving, of emotional hunger, of sacred exhaustion, then this is not a condemnation, but an invitation. Step back from the shadows that are not yours. Turn inward. Face the silence you have fled. Speak to the parts of you that merge to survive. Honor them. Thank them. And then release them. You're not a sponge. You're not a sacrifice. You are not broken for the sake of others' comfort. You are a living threshold, a place where energy becomes meaning, where pain is met, not swallowed, where empathy becomes wisdom. If you can hold this subtle fire, this delicate clarity, then you will not only survive your sensitivity, you will sanctify it. You will walk among the world's ghosts and no longer be haunted. You will witness pain without performing penance. You will feel without falling. And most importantly, you will return to yourself, not as a rescuer, but as a soul. Remember, empathy is not absorption. It is alchemy. It is the fire through which suffering is recognized, not adopted, witnessed, not owned, transformed, but never stolen. This is the path Jung warned us about. It is not easy, but it is the path to wholeness, to sovereignty, to true compassion. Thank you for listening. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts below. And remember, your sensitivity is not your weakness. It is your invitation to become whole.